I want to acknowledge some of the people in the room who have been doing really yeoman's work for years for a number of different causes pertaining to sustainability and solar. But before I do that, I just want us to be able to take a moment of silence just to allow ourselves to gently come into this space and be here now. Well, let me begin by, as I indicated, honoring some of the energy that's in this room. And it's a little dangerous to do this because everybody in this room deserves to be credited for, at the very least, coming out and listening to me. You had another choice tonight, and I want to acknowledge that that shows your commitment to the issue, not necessarily to the speaker. But hopefully I'll rise to the occasion and provide you with some really critical information that each of you would be able to use in your talking about the process and the incredibly powerful source of energy that solar represents in our lives. So let me begin. I just want to acknowledge Doug Schumacher. Doug has been, he's on the board of MNSEIA. We've got a couple of other board members here as well, Dustin Dennison, and I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce his better half, Jessica, at the same time. Jan Hubbard is sitting at the back of the room, is also on MNSEIA. These are people that have worked right from the very beginning to organize our association. And it's taken some time, it's taken a lot of energy, but they've hung in there, and we're in the process of creating some really significant results in the state. I want to recognize Gail Prest from Minneapolis, who, without her assistance and her ongoing energy, we wouldn't have a lot of programs that are really essential to helping to finance solar in the state. She's doing really incredible work right now to help verify the value of solar, working with the PUC. Rebecca Kramer has been working with Bioneers for how many years? About six. So for those of you that attend the Bioneers conference, make sure you thank Rebecca at some point before you leave this evening. So like I said, it's always dangerous to acknowledge people, and of course you saw Laura earlier doing the work that she's doing to try to manage a lot of really good people with a lot of energy with MRES. So having said that, I'm going to walk through a lot of stuff. I was looking at that whiteboard. If there's somebody that can figure out how to set that up and find some markers, I'd really appreciate it, because I'm kind of a multimodal presenter. I like to be able to write on things while I'm also displaying this stuff. So if we're able to, if somebody can grab that, set it up, and find some markers, that'd be really helpful, I think, at some point when we start talking about the elements of legislation. So what's going on with solar in Minnesota? You can see from just this introductory slide that there's really an important element, there's really an important message that we've been working on for the last 3 years. We introduced legislation in the 2010 session, both in the House and the Senate side. We haven't been able to move that. It's called the 10% by 2030 solar energy standard. Let's be clear, this is on top of the renewable energy standard. It's not a carve-out. We're not going in and saying, let's take some wind off of line and substitute it for solar. We're saying let's keep as much wind as we possibly can and use solar to help grow the totality of renewable energy that's required in our state. One of the things that we say a lot, you'll hear this throughout the presentation this evening, is that talking about a solar energy standard for us is just as much, maybe even more, about an economic development program in Minnesota as it is about an energy policy. Many times we've experienced this in our discussions with legislators, with folks over the years, that we've sequestered ourselves, if you will, into a discussion about, and sometimes pretty granular discussion about, energy policy, and not really grounded ourselves, not really created the context for why would we do this beyond the energy piece. That's important and it's exciting, but we have an opportunity in Minnesota with solar to grow the next big economic development cluster. So how does that happen? Minnesota's solar industry has significant assets and the potential to attract major investments to Minnesota's economy. What's it going to take? We had a presentation December of 2010 by a gentleman from the West Coast who has been working as a consultant with a number of firms all over the country who come to them and say, give us the short list of locations in this country where we would get a good return on our investment if we built a plant, decided to do an installation sales program for solar. Well, Minnesota's not on that list. Not sad to say, but you need three things to be on that list, and these are the three things. You need a clear and significant demand signal. Now, it's a little bit of a mystery what that actually means. Does it mean you got to have 1,000 megawatts? Does it mean you need 100 megawatts? You certainly aren't going to get there by doing 10 megawatts a year, or even 20. So we've got to have a demand signal. Clearly 10% by 2030 would do that. The ramp-up schedule, and I'll talk more about that we're proposing, is more modest than that, but we think even in its modesty provides a significant demand signal. You need a stable and a diverse supply chain. That means that if you're an original equipment manufacturer looking to locate in a state like Minnesota, do you have the suppliers around you that can provide you with the frames, with adhesive, with the fasteners, with the components and materials that you need? That's a really critical piece of this, and we'll talk some more about that as well. And you need a clean energy statutory support environment. Folks aren't going to move to a state and invest in a state if there isn't an RES like we've got already. They're not going to invest in a state if the statutory environment for environmental legislation isn't supportive, like the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, like the 1.5 reduction in energy usage that's part of the Next Generation Energy Act. And those are the kinds of things that, along with solar, have to be in place. So we're going to do a quick assessment. I'm not going to go straight through to this, the potential and kind of do the scorecard. I'm going to talk about a few other things before I get to that, but keep this in mind. You need three things, and we're going to check in and decide how many of those we have in place and why that gives us an advantage as Minnesota in the discussion about developing a clear demand signal. What's going on in solar? Well, a year ago, I don't think any of us would have been using some of these terms. The reality is that in the past 5 years, the solar industry has transformed itself. Think about that. I mean, we're talking about an industry that is growing exponentially, not just on a linear curve. It's bolting off the charts. There are continued price declines. Some of that's artificial, based on some of the products that are being shipped in from China, but a lot of that is organic. And there's a lot more to come, because as we probably all know, many of you in this room, Gail and those people who have been working with the Sunshot Initiative and Solar Cities, realize that some of these soft costs are really what's killing us now. That we've gotten about as much cost as we can out of the hard technology, the modules, but we are really straining to reduce the cost and the other parts of the solar value chain, such as the permitting fees and insurance and interconnection policies. We've got mature capital markets. The finance industry is beginning to embrace solar. They understand that it's not a new or risky technology, that it's mature, and beyond that, it has huge opportunities for ongoing return on investment. Market acceptance is a provider of peak energy and capacity. It almost goes without saying anymore, although we do have to say it to legislators and policymakers, that one of the stellar aspects of solar is that it's the premier source of peak energy. It's kind of contradictory, but the sun creates a lot of intense radiation and creates the need for air conditioning, and it simultaneously creates an enormous amount of power to offset some of the needs and demand that it's put in place itself. But it's at the right place at the right time. It's a great peak energy source, but it's also beginning to play with base load capacity. You don't hear too much about that anymore, or excuse me, yet, but you're going to hear more and more as we go forward. These are some of the numbers. 71% growth rate. Anybody here want to venture if there's any other industry in the country that can say it's got a 71% growth rate? Now, granted, we started small, and to a certain extent, it's because we've started small that we can boast those kinds of growth rates, but it's still phenomenal. What do some of the actual raw costs look like? The install pricing is down 19.3% year over year. You can see what the cost for the different sectors are, residential, non-residential, and honestly, look at this number. And anybody here, really, honestly, and I'll just concede, I'm shocked. That's a very low number. That's an indication that we're moving into that realm of true competition with other energy sources. Now, there's some dangers because that's utility scale. Not that utility scale is dangerous, but we need to make sure that all aspects of the market, residential, commercial, industrial, and utility scale, are given support to grow. So these, again, are some of the numbers. What's going on with modules, as this indicates, is that the costs have come down, and it's not an exaggeration, a staggering 43%. So what you're going to see this session is a bill that has a lot of different components. I've already talked about the what we call the SES, the Solar Energy Standard, 10% by 2030. But our biggest concern, I have to tell you, is not what's going to happen in 20 years, but what's going to happen in 5, what's going to happen in 10. Guaranteed, if we don't have an industry established in the next 5 years in Minnesota, it's not going to happen in the next 20 or 10 years. This is really critical for us to get the flag in the ground, to make sure that we've got the resources to begin even a modest scale up. So what we're suggesting in our ramp up is something on the order of 2 to 3% by 2022. Is that enough? Does that give us the significant demand signal that I was talking about? We think so. That comes to about a gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts by 2020. Essentially, it's about 80 to 90 megawatts of installed solar each year as an increment going forward.
Your previous slide, was that after incentives?
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you repeat that last one? It's about how much a year?
It would be roughly 80. The first year, for example, in 2014, it'd be 80 megawatts of installed solar. And then,
The 2 to 3% by 20.
right, and then it would ramp up a little slower like it'd be 91 the next year, it'd be 127 the next year. Man, what a geek. I mean, that I'm remembering these numbers, that kind of scares me too. I would like to get through the slides, but I want to try to also honor people's questions. So why don't we do this? Jan, let me at least put up the elements, and then I'll answer your question if that works. 2 is what's called the value of solar rate, and that's the slide that's up in front of you right now. I'm going to get into that in a minute. 4 is the made in Minnesota, 3, I have to read my own numbers. Incentive. And then there's some other pieces to this that are important. A standard offering, long-term contract. With it's basically, well, I'll put this up here, performance-based. Rather than nameplate. So there's a big shift. In the past, our incentives have been, for how much you intended to install versus how much you were able to actually produce. So it shifts into a more market-driven, performance-based approach to incentives, and that encourages competition. It encourages better technology. So there are other elements, but these are the key pieces. So you've got the SES, 10 to 3% in the first 10 years, the value of solar rate, a made in Minnesota incentive that will be stacked on top of that, and a long-term contract that's performance-based that essentially is using that stack of the value of solar rate and the incentive to get a return on investment for significant installation in the state. Okay, Jan, I promise I'd come back to you. Did I trample over your question?
These are what's in the solar jobs bill that's before the House right now?
Yeah.
And,
Now these are elements. There's some language issues that we're still working out, and I'd be happy to get into the weeds on that later. I don't know if people want to get there right now.
And there's a component of bypassing the 40 kilowatt cap in there too, isn't there?
Well, I mean, there is. Our approach to that is that we believe the buy-all, sell-all, which is this is a version of a buy-all, sell-all protocol, really helps us resolve the issues that have been endemic to the net metering protocol in the state. The resistance to increasing the cap essentially goes away because we now have a dual meter system, one meter that is basically paid according to these components that are put together in a single rate. So you're essentially having a production meter where the utilities are paying you a rate that they have determined and quantified and calculated will benefit them and other ratepayers. So there's a quantifiable benefit for peak energy pricing that they now save. There's a quantifiable benefit to them for that. There's a quantifiable benefit that displaces, here I am pointing when I could be using this fancy thing. Oops. This is the savings from not having to install or bring online new peaker capacity. It's a big deal. It's a savings. It's a quantifiable benefit to ratepayers. Distribution energy, the line loss savings, anywhere from 5 to 10% from local generation. We have a distribution capacity benefit because it reduces the congestion on feeders, meaning they're more reliable. That kind of gets into this discussion down here where you reduce outage potential, brownouts, the kind of things that we don't see that much of in our state, but it's a really common problem in a lot of other utility regions in the country. There's some issues though, and it's becoming clear that this is something that has to be and will be reduced as a result of the installation of solar. Fuel price mitigation, yeah, natural gas is incredibly cheap right now, but there's nobody that's paying attention that thinks that it's going to stay this low, and that in fact, within the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see significant rapid increases. Some of that's going to be because the regulations on fracking and other issues are really going to kick in, and so kind of this artificially developing market is going to have to pay its way, and those costs for natural gas are going to go up. Well, everybody knows the cost of solar is free, so if you're concerned about what's going to happen with the increase in natural gas prices, as well they should as utilities, this becomes another quantifiable benefit. Yep. Jim.
Currently, under the solar rewards program, renewable energy credits go to Excel. Given this buy all, sell all approach, is that likely to happen across the board?
You mean with every utility? Yeah. Now, let's be clear. What we're going to get, what we hope, is going to be the basis for a uniform statewide formula. That there'll be agreement about how you do the calculations, but each utility is going to use those formulas with their data, and they will output, in most cases, a unique value of solar rate. So it might be I'm speculating, but let's just say, GRE's co-ops might come out with 9 cents or 9.5. Excel's might be 10 cents or 11 cents a kilowatt hour. Whatever that number is, though, is a really significant number because it's a rate. It's not an incentive. Yeah, Jim?
The challenge with that is, for example, many institutions are going to essentially trying to do carbon offsets themselves, tackling the problem directly. So right now, if I do something, it's not likely because we're not in Excel territory. If the college I work for does something with Excel, we can't use that renewable energy as an offset for our carbon. And so that's one problem. The other problem then is there a mechanism within this whole system that if those things do become valuable, that goes back to the ratepayers?
Right. Well, it's a really good discussion to have, and maybe if we could park that for a minute and come back to it, we could get through some of the other things. We will be introducing language that calls for ownership by the system owners of the RECs. We'll probably run into some pretty significant dispute over that from Excel and some of the other utilities, but we're going to go there and we're going to have that discussion. And a lot of things, as people know, don't get done the first year. But I am proud to say, and I don't think just a raving optimist, we're going to get something in each of these categories. We're going to get a number. May not be 10%, may not be exactly 2% by 2022, but guaranteed, we're going to get a number. We're going to get a value of solar rate. Not sure exactly how we're going to get the whole process set up and set in motion, but we're going to get a rate. There's going to be a Made in Minnesota incentive, and it's going to be production or performance-based. Now, a lot of people would look at this and say, wow, you're going to do all that? Yeah, it's one of the most significant pieces of energy legislation that's been introduced in the last 10 years. And why it's important for us to keep coming back to this idea of what is really at the foundation of this and what's going to drive this forward isn't that it's the most significant piece of energy legislation, but that it's the most significant piece of economic development legislation. So we've got a winning combination, we think, and that's one of the reasons why somebody like myself can stand up here and make those kind of pronouncements. It doesn't hurt that we have a few Democrats that support us. That's a really nice and exciting development. I can guarantee you last session was not my favorite experience. So, you know, this will be much better, put a lot more smiles on everybody's faces in this room. Jan?
I've heard some ideas that there should be a rate incentive on top of the value of solar incentive. Is there anything in the solar jobs bill for that?
Yeah, it's the Made in Minnesota incentive.
Okay.
Basically what that's going to be, let me see if I, okay, this is kind of how it's going to work. Wow, this is right on time. I'm glad you asked that question, Jan. The value of solar, how it works. So, yeah, I'm still learning. You can see I somehow severed sunsets up there with my arrow, but what you see here, oops, what you see here is the value of solar rate. That's the foundation. So let's say it's 10 cents. It's going to be somewhere in that range, most likely, at least with the IOUs, the investor-owned utilities. And stacked on top of that is going to be this set of incentives that, as costs go down, will be adjusted so that it reflects that competitiveness in the market. But, you know, it could be 15 cents. It may be even higher than that. But that's what you're talking about, Jan. And what we're doing right now is creating a calculus that helps people understand that for every increment of made in Minnesota product, there is a corresponding and quantifiable output that benefits Minnesotans. So it's like for this number of jobs in the state, in other words, this amount of content in the products that, you know, this goes towards, you would get X amount of tax revenue and economic output for the state. It's not speculation. You know, it's something that we can quantify and be pretty conservative about. So essentially what you've got is two really strong benefits. You've got a ratepayer benefit here, and you've got a taxpayer benefit here that we're quantifying. So you've got a bill that's built on two pillars. You know, one benefit for ratepayers that's quantified by the utilities, and an incentive that quantifies the economic benefit, the tax revenue benefit that stacks on top of that. And that's what we hope will provide the whole set of incentives necessary to drive investment at the scale necessary to get to some of these numbers. Yeah?
These rates have all been tied to inflation.
Yeah. I mean, all of it. We've got a pretty elaborate spreadsheet that takes that into account. A lot of what we do is start with what we call a reference price to help kind of figure out where the range is for what's required for investment and see how we can tweak the numbers to fit into that. But that reference price always has a 7% decline in cost, and I believe, I don't remember what the inflation factor is, but that gets factored in to that reference price.
Is it purely a predictive factor or a reactive factor? So if inflation changes based on our estimates now for 2013, will the factor change?
Well, in both parts of the bill, the value of solar rate portion and in the Made in Minnesota incentive portion, there's an adjustment. We're not quite sure we want to do it every year, but you know, at least on some reasonably frequent periodic basis. So it could be 2 years. And we're also trying to, you know, we're playing around with what we call a volumetric approach, so that it's not just a totally linear installation process. There's a chance that we'd hit our number midway, you know, for 2014, midway through 2014. Okay, do we now just stop the market and say, let's stop growing? Or do we basically say, go to the next tranche, you know, take that next piece down right there in the middle of 2014 and start moving? You know, there's a good chance that could happen. Now, that makes it a more complex calculation, and maybe we need to avoid some of those complexities, but it's something that we're talking about. Yep, here's another important part, 10 to 20-year standard contract. So essentially you sign up for a contract that goes out 20 years from this point. Now, you know, you don't adjust your contract every year, but that 20 or 10-year contract is pegged to this price going out. But it stacks in, it'll have this, and this may adjust too, just like I said, because you're going to have to basically have two adjustments that are working at the same time. And that's one of the reasons we're a little bit hesitant to say that has to happen every year, because it could just be too onerous for everybody to be doing that. Yep, go ahead.
If that 15% price or whatever the bumped up price from the base rate extends for 20 years, would that be a disincentive for Excel to buy those rates if they know that 3 years from now those rates will be cheaper?
Well, I mean, if there's a number that they have to achieve, that's part of why this has to work together. They're still going to have to achieve those numbers. So, yeah, if it drops down, if it was just a totally open and you know, let's just let the so-called market work with those numbers, we wouldn't get anywhere. You know, we'd basically be waiting for the price to come down. And when we waited for the price to come down, our entrance into the market is past.
And the price coming down is dependent on more capacity they install.
Right. You know, so that drives the, you know, the scale drives some of the cost reductions, both in production, manufacturing, and on the installation side. So let me get back to talking about the jobs question. This is one of my favorite parts of whenever I talk about solar in Minnesota. What's good about solar energy jobs for Minnesota? Well, it's family supporting jobs now. And now is the operative term there because these are jobs that from conception to implementation, from throwing the switch and turning it over, is anywhere from 6 to 18 months. When was the last time somebody here heard about even a natural gas peaker plant going online that fast? Anybody want to venture the last time a nuclear plant got done in less than 18 years? So there's a vast advantage on, you know, having solar jobs when you've got people in the trades where in many cases they still have 40% unemployment. So going to those folks and saying, you know, let's support the development or incentivize nuclear plants. Yeah, there are going to be some jobs, but not when they need them, now. So what's the choice? You know, let's do some solar because it's going to bring jobs on now. There are jobs that grow all across the state. It's not just one place. That's the beauty of solar, is that it is the distributed energy source. Go on rooftops, fields, property adjacent to properties. It's a very distributed source. It's one of the reasons that it's so attractive. It adds jobs through energy independence. Right now, Minnesota ships out of the state, and I'll talk some more about this later, $20 billion to support fuel for electricity, transportation, and heating. It's a big, big number. Now, why are we doing that when we have abundant sources of renewable energy in solar, wind, biomass, ground source heating? It's absurd. It costs us enormous amounts of money, and what it does, it simultaneously destroys the multipliers that we can get by spending that money in our communities. I mean, think about it. I mean, that money is money that should be cycling through all of these communities around Minnesota rather than being shipped out of the state to states that have coal that are in the process of removing their mountaintops, or to parts of the universe where, you know, there's going to be another oil spill disaster, or parts of the world that don't really like us that much. So, you know, what are the choices that we're making? It's absurd that we're not capitalizing on this abundance of renewable energy in our state. Jan?
So on that note, what's to keep like big installers and developers from California, New Jersey to come to Minnesota, capture that business, and then ship the money back out of state?
Some of that's going to happen. We are going to have some big systems to reach our numbers, but the reason that we have a Made in Minnesota component, and there'll be incentives to make sure that the most significant portion of what we build in Minnesota or install in Minnesota, we make in Minnesota.
Well, we have some of the biggest construction companies in Minnesota. Why don't they get, you know, if we need a big construction company, why don't the Minnesota construction companies get some incentives too? I mean, the largest wind installer in the nation's from Minnesota.
They may, but you know, if they're at 176 and installed watt, they're competitive.
I'm just saying.
They don't need us to give them an extra bump to drive their price further down. What they need is the incentive to go ahead and use their price competitiveness to install those systems, and that's what we're trying to do.
We can't keep more of that money in the state too.
Well, we can. I mean, there's going to be some discussion about you know, local installers and an incentive for out of state. Well, we're still talking about that, so we'll see. But you know, I think the idea here is that we need to be careful not to just throw a big number out there and say, fill that number with the most competitive pricing, which means that it's Chinese panels and out-of-state workers. And boom, you know, how are you going to recover from that? Because the market share that we just lost. And it's going to be extremely difficult if that happens for us to come back in and build up the domestic industry, the manufacturing and the installer capacity in the state. In fact, one of the things, and Gail and I were talking about this before we started tonight, we're going to need to be careful about how quickly we start this program. So our bill calls for a 6-month, essentially, development period so that we are able to muster the installers to make sure that the manufacturing capacity is there for us to meet the demands that we're going to create. So let's just speculate. We could come in and say, you know what, you need to install 80 megawatts in 2013. And what I just described, that scenario I just described, is what would happen. Because we wouldn't have the manufacturing capacity to meet that demand that quickly, and we wouldn't have the installer capacity to do the installations. So, you know, it's like it all sounds good, but you have to think about how you're going to actually supply that kind of demand so that we actually capture the jobs and get these benefits. Otherwise, what Lynn's saying is just a bunch of hooey. You know, it sounds good until 3 or 4 years from now, and people look back and say, why did you do that? Well, we reduced some greenhouse gas emissions, okay? But we didn't get all the other things that you said were so critical for our state to get, and they'd be right. So using Minnesota manufacturing assets makes Minnesota an investment target. I'll talk a little bit more about that. New reliable grid and more solar jobs. We know we're moving towards not just distributed generation, but microgrids that, you know, allow the movement of energy, energy storage, building management systems, energy efficiency, demand response. All of these things are now clustered together, and solar, of all the energy sources, plays the best with each of those, helps to integrate the best in a microgrid or a distributed generation system. What are we doing for time?
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Woo. Okay. Okay, I'll zip then. Good paying jobs all over Minnesota. This is an example of the different types of jobs. One thing I want to make clear is that with manufacturing jobs, we're not just talking about engineers, we're not just talking about developers, we're not just talking about folks with degrees. We're talking about people who can walk into a plant that may not have the skill set. So, you know, in terms of what this represents, you know, I'm not just concerned about jobs for Minnesotans abstractly. There's an opportunity for a more inclusive economy with what we're building here. And that's part of what excites me and I think should excite all of us in this room. Good Jobs Now, we talked about that. Energy independence, we talked about that. Here's an interesting chart. Many of you have seen this before. Here's this, much talked about comparison of subsidies, so-called, for renewables versus fossil fuels. Here's fossil fuels, $70.2 billion. That doesn't include what they're using, perhaps wasting on carbon capture and storage. And here's us, traditional renewables. It doesn't even break out solar. Solar would be a much even much smaller portion of this. But do the math. 12.2 billion versus 70.2 billion. Now this is research done by the Environmental Law Institute from 2002 to 2008. Yep.
That excludes a lot of the stimulus money that came online in 2009.
Yeah. Yeah. So that would skew it. That would, bump this up a little bit, but not much. To be honest, if anybody has, taken a look at what has happened even since then in comparing what's gone on with the nuclear industry and the insurance process and some of the newer subsidies for oil and coal. So if somebody says that to you, tell them to go check this out. It's really compelling. So again, I said I'd come back to this, and to my word, I'm going to just check off. Here it is. Oops, keep doing that. This is what we need, a clear and significant demand signal. We already have a stable and diverse solar supply chain and a clean energy statutory support environment. When I say we've got a stable and diverse supply chain, we've got 30, actually it's closer to 40 Minnesota manufacturers of materials, components, and final products for the solar industry. That represents about 2,000 direct jobs and an equal number of next-tier manufacturing suppliers all across the state. Do the math. That's a significant industry already. Now, from where I come from, it's a nice idea to go out and create something from scratch, but it's a better idea if you're able to build something that's already in place and make it grow further. That's what we can do in Minnesota. We're not going to the legislature and saying, let's start a whole new industry in Minnesota. We're saying we have a solar manufacturing supply chain. We have the capacity. Let's build on that. Basically, we get a twofer, because if we get a demand signal, we don't have to go after incentivizing the supply chain. That's what they're doing in other states. They're having to throw billions of dollars into both, having an incentive for the demand and an incentive for the capital-intensive supply chain. Well, we've got that supply chain in place. So it's a very cost-effective program that we're suggesting that the state ramp up. We've got the installers, developers, and distributors and trainers that are able to meet a rising demand for solar installations. In case people wonder, we're in the process of actually planning the 6th Solar Manufacturing Supply Chain Roundtable. We've had 5 already all over the state. So, we're an industry that's on the ground, ready to produce the supplies for this new standard and the value of solar rate. A couple of other things that we're going to be working on. There's a PACE fix. It's being carried by the agency, the Division of Energy Resources, to allow a 20-year term for financing on PACE. There's a fix in solar for state-bonded building retrofits that would move it from being optional or a may to a must. And that'll help increase demand as well. And here's all the folks all around the state, businesses and manufacturers that are doing solar as installers, trainers, developers, manufacturers. It's a great place to be. we're in the process of making something really special happen in Minnesota with solar, and I'm really delighted that all of you are part of this process, and will be able to help, I hope, meet with legislators and other folks and tell them it's time. Let's make this happen this year.
What would be the annual cost to the state for this GOIS program, I guess, to the state taxpayers?
Well, it's a ratepayer. Right now, it's going to be on ratepayers, and it depends on some of the numbers. I'm not trying to be evasive, but it'd be in the range of $25 to $35 million a year.
And a lot of that charged to utilities? Or
Yeah, it'd be a ratepayer, burden, if you want to call it that. That's why the value of solar is so important, is that it takes an initial piece of that cost and puts it in a different category of benefit rather than just a giveaway or an incentive.
And is the value of the U.S. go to new solar, or do existing installations or utilities receive an extra benefit?
Say that again.
Well, the incentives, is it for all to create new solar installations, or is it, how does it affect the basic rate that people who have solar installations already existing change?
It's not going to be retroactive, but if you had a system and you wanted to grow it, if you had a,
So it is
2 kilowatt, I don't know, how many kilowatts do you have on your
about
5? If Philip wanted to grow his system to another 3 so he could plug in his electric vehicle that he's dreaming about buying, he could use this program for that new 3.
So it is for new systems?
Right,
Okay.
right. Dustin?
In relation to the question that's asked about fees to ratepayers for solar, how would that equate to looking at either A, nuclear construction, expansion, storage of nuclear waste? Because Excel has to come up with some decisions on where it's going to continue to grow and receive its energy from.
Well, and that's a really, really good point, because there's something potentially really, I don't know if I want to use the word, it's too fear-based, dangerous, but there's a potential looming issue if we allow the utilities to change their fleet from their fleet of coal plants, which they're going to do for any number of reasons, to natural gas. And a significant portion of that new energy capacity isn't solar or wind or other renewables. It means that essentially if that fleet gets shifted out from coal to natural gas, which would be a good thing in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we don't get any of the economic development, any of the other benefits that we should from the use of our abundant renewable energy in this state, most notably solar. That's a difficult situation. The train will have left the station, is essentially what I'm saying, and having to come back and say, okay, well, how about doing some solar? They're going to be like, we kind of fixed the problem, and you weren't part of the solution. So now's the time. Okay, Jim?
I got a couple questions tied together, and I'll preface it because it's come across as being a little bit hostile, but I don't intend it that way.
Oh, okay. Well, that's all right. You can't be more hostile than some of the questions I get from legislators.
It comes down to, because the way to think about these is, we're essentially making a deal with the utilities to get solar. And so these are questions really about, are we getting the best deal?
Right.
And so related to, what's possible under this new buy-all, sell-all, are we still going to be able to, if we're in the right situation, to put solar behind the meter and not mess around with the utility? Or are we going to be forced to go through them? Because if you're a large electricity consumer, you can end up with a lot of rigmarole and possibly, you give up your rec credits, for example, if you must sell all, buy all, sell.
Well,
that-
it resolves a lot of problems, but not all. So, we're aware that we have some of those components that have to be thought through. Again, we're willing to do a lot. We're not sure we're going to get it all done. But those are certainly important questions for us to look at. One of the things that we're very aware of is that we want to be able to put in place foundations that will allow us to stay on this path and grow and develop market penetration in a somewhat straight path rather than too many zigs and zags. There have been other states that haven't kind of thought through some of this, so that they're having to go back and try to fix things, and it's extremely difficult. That's what's going on in Colorado, with a lot of their program, is that, Excel is having a heck of a time, dealing with some of the things that they want to do in terms of recovering their fixed cost. Well, the buy all, sell all, the dual meter process is really an answer to that for them, but it also provides us with an enormous benefit to grow in industry without having to cap capacity. Don't get me wrong, when I say we wouldn't cap capacity, there's going to be some need to be very understanding, have a clear picture of what impact your solar array is going to have on the network. So it's going to be more tied to what the capacity of the network is, meaning that grid. So if you got a small co-op, you can't just come in and say, okay, that Walmart that's in that rural community can install 1-2 megawatts and not understand its impact on the grid. So those things are going to have to be understood and taken into account. Was there another question?
Continuing on that, we're getting the best deal. I just saw a published statistic that said that new coal plants are 12.8 cents a kilowatt hour for cost. If that's the case, what's in this arrangement to push the utilities to get away from running those, the old ones into the new ones? And is this the right, maybe solar is even more valuable than this? Are we getting the good deal?
Well, it's a moving target. This is an industry, and it's not just solar, but the clean energy industry as a whole, which also includes energy efficiency and demand response, is evolving very rapidly, and it's hard to keep up. So what you're talking about is something that we're aware of, and there's discussion about that. So when you get back to the value of solar, one of the things that you hear is a discussion about capacity and long-term capacity planning, which is what you're discussing, at least in part. So yeah, it's being looked at. The environmental question, actually I should have put it on the list. How do you value RECs? How do you value, how do you calculate the costs that currently aren't internalized? That's a tough one, but we got to get there and have those tough discussions. We're not agnostic at all. I mean, one of the reasons that I do this work is because I'm very concerned about what we're doing to the climate. And this seems like a confluence of being able to provide something that's really valuable that meets another concern. But we do tend to lead, as you've experienced with the jobs and the energy opportunities that solar represents. There are a bunch of questions still, Doug. All right, Manu.
Could I ask who the authors are for your bill? But I just want to say that our League of Women Voters, we have positions, and our forum is time to be, to take action in the legislature. So we'd like to put the bill on our website, and John Marty and Jean McGinnis are going to be on the panel.
Oh, cool.
So, but who are the authors?
Yay. Wow. This is so fun for me to, so blessed to be working with some really great people on the House side. The House author is Will Morgan, He's from the southern suburbs, swing district Democrat. He's very strongly supported by Chairman Melissa Hortman. And we've got a number of other co-authors that we're beginning to work with and pull in as we move forward. On the Senate side, Senator Chris Eaton is our chief author, and she as well is working very closely with Chairman Marty on the Senate side. So, you know, we haven't seen this kind of cluster of really strong support. Doesn't mean that there aren't challenges. You know, we know there are people that don't believe a lot of this stuff, and they've been using data points from 5 years ago or 10 years ago, even worse, and they just sort of like, well, I mean, I had a representative, good guy, you know, asked me today, well, isn't this value of solar artificial? And I'm like, it's a market-driven assessment. It's an assessment based on market analysis. And it was like this light went on. Oh, you're really doing that? You know, this is actually going to be a market-driven program? I didn't think you guys did that stuff. Well, okay, guess what? We do. And excited that everybody had a chance to hear what we're doing. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Lynn.